So you've been doing your podcast, Boys Are From Märzen, for several months now. What is it that you feel like is something important that you've learned from going through this process of hosting the show for 7-8 months?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about this a lot the other day I was thinking back about the questions I was asking in the beginning to my first, 5 to 6 guests and the questions I ask now. And I noticed I'm kind of going away from the questions of like, what can we do to get more women in the industry? Like, what would you tell other women? And just normalizing the fact that women work in this industry. I'm not asking them those questions. I'm just being like, what do you do? Why do you do it? And, tell me about it, or tell me about the brewery you work at. And I always started this to normalize women working in the beer industry. And I've kind of transitioned away from promoting it to just, hey, this is it. Because if this was a normal podcast where it was 2 men speaking to each other about working in the industry, they wouldn't be like, how do we get more men to get into the industry? So I know I started this podcast to, showcase women in the industry and to get more women involved, but I've noticed I'm not asking those questions where it's like, what can we as women do to promote more women? I'm just, talking about what they do and, different aspects of their career. And I thought that was really interesting because I didn't intentionally stop asking those questions. It just kind of evolved because I realized like, this is like just talking, just asking the questions and hearing people's story, how they got into beer or how they got to be a beer reporter or whatever aspect they do in the beer industry. That's just enough to have people listen and be like, oh, I can do that too. Not specifically asking my guest, hey, what can other people do to get in the beer industry?
Yeah, that's really interesting because I think one of the really important parts of that too, it sounds like, is it opens you up as an interviewer to be able to go toward a whole host of other topics, that you're not just thinking about your person X, why are you doing this for Z? How do you feel like that's allowed you maybe to ask different questions or approach people in a different way because you aren't thinking of it as like, well, I should ask this question. Now you just don't even have to ask a question about it at all.
No, I remember even, after I kind of stopped answering them, I asked one of my interviewers kind of that question that I haven't done before. And it just felt so awkward. It felt forced. It's like, yes, we're women in beer. We have to be like, how do we get other women? So it just makes the conversation so much more comfortable and it has a nice flow to it. Most of my conversations, my podcast is, I'm talking to my guests about their career and just other things about them. So when I stop and then ask how, what we can do to better promote women in this industry, it just feels awkward. So there's a better flow to my podcast. And I think the guests feel, people don't like to talk about themselves, but they like to talk about themselves in the sense that they know they can talk about themselves. They're more comfortable with it because they know the answer to it. Like if I ask someone, oh, what did you do at this place and blah, 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 they can be like, oh, I did this, instead of like coming up with this good answer about like, how can we promote other women to become head brewers at breweries, So it just creates a flow in my podcast. It's a lot more comfortable for both me and my guest as well.
Yeah. How do you think about asking good questions?
So I do a lot of research in the sense I look up my guests. Obviously, I know who my guests are before. And, I do a little research. Every podcast, I prepare at least 10 questions. And obviously during the podcast, some other questions come up. But basically, I just kind of go through their career. If it's brewing, I go by brewery and ask them what they did there. If it's a reporter, ask them about, the stories they've written and just, what stories they love to write. So I just do a lot of research by looking up the guests and looking at their career, seeing what they're involved in. Oh, sorry, my heat just turned on. It's really loud. Sorry, I forgot to turn it off. And just, asking them about that. And usually kind of the way that they answer it, I can go in a certain direction. I'm a writer, I'm a journalist, so I like to tell stories. And I know by asking questions and seeing how they're responding, I can see kind of how the podcast and how the story is going.
So you're describing one way in which you feel like your behavior in the podcast has changed, the kind of questions you're asking. Is there something you feel like you've gotten better at as well, being a particular skill, just in the way that you host, you ask questions, you do your research, that has improved from when you started in 2020 to where we are now in 21?
Yeah, I tried. I'm a writer, so I feel like I always need to elaborate on my questions and like explain them or something. I've learned really just to keep them like, obviously I'm having them on, having my guests on to have for people to listen to their story. They don't want to hear about me. And sometimes I feel like I need to connect to the interviewee. So sometimes I'll throw in something about me to like show the connection. But I've like realized like people know about me and know my story. If I'm sure the people want to listen to hear their story. So what I've really learned is to ask the question, maybe chime in a little here and there if it's to add something to that person's answer, but just keeping my questions short and sweet and to the point, and not to ramble on, for 2 minutes on top of the question. Because it feels when I go back and listen to it to edit it, it feels awkward. So, and that's just something, you learn as being a podcast host. It's just to ask the questions and be a host and be that person who can transition from one question to the other and continue on the interview.